Dominic, when the word is given, I will get started.
Okay, we are live.
All right. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for this most important public conversation about one of the most talked about and yet most misunderstood topics in American society, politics and culture, critical race theory, or CRT. I'm Ken Clark, Director of the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. Tonight's program is the first of a two-part series, to discuss the facts regarding critical race theory and deconstruct the fictions associated with the term. On Wednesday, April 13th at 7:00 p.m., part two of this series will occur, featuring Gregory S. Parks, Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives at Wake Forest University School of Law, and a 2008 graduate of Cornell Law School. We are joined today by two very capable scholars of the law who will unpack CRT for us in a manner that can be understood to both the general public and legal experts. CRT, in short, originated in the 1980s. It was created as an interdisciplinary field in law schools by legal scholars Kimberly Crenshaw, who majored in Africana Studies at Cornell as an undergraduate in the 1970s, Neil Gatanda, and Stephanie Phillips. CRT is an analytical tool which, in Crenshaw's own words, explores how racial inequality was historically structured into the fabric of the American Republic, reinforced by law, insulated by the founding Constitution, and embedded in the infrastructure of American society. CRT is not taught in public schools, where in a number of cases, curriculum, training, and readings have been used to examine the history of American racism in its contemporary reality. It is not taught in diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings, reading and discussion groups, and places of employment. It may inform anti-racist writing and activism, such as that of Ibram X. Kendi and numerous others, but is not typically the framework used by these writers and activists. Yet CRT has become a cudgel in the hands of politicians, parents, and pundits to attack any effort that pursues an honest reckoning with America's racist past and present. Edweek.org reports that since January 2021, 42 states have introduced bills or taken other steps that will restrict teaching critical race theory or limit how teachers can discuss racism and sexism, according to an Education Week analysis. 15 states have imposed these bans and restrictions either through legislation or other avenues. CRT has been labeled as divisive, blamed for teaching white children to feel bad about themselves, promoting anti-white hatred and indoctrination. Professor Crenshaw drew parallels in a Los Angeles Times opinion piece between the so-called anti-CRT movement and the massive resistance of the Civil Rights era in opposition to the 1954 Supreme Court decision, which ruled public school segregation as unconstitutional. The incapacity of what Crenshaw called an enduring faction of American society that has long resisted a national reckoning of race is one reason critical race theory, properly understood, is necessary. Our two guest speakers will elaborate on this necessity. Our first speaker, Cedric M. Powell, is the Wyatt, Tarrant, and Combs Professor of Law at the Louis D. Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. Professor Powell has written over a broad range of topics in his career, including affirmative action and critical race theory, the First Amendment and hate speech, and the 14th Amendment and structural inequality. Our second speaker, Etienne C. Toussaint, is assistant professor at the University of South Carolina Law School. Professor Toussaint is a critical legal history scholar of political economy, political theory, and intellectual history, with a focus in particular on urban communities in the United States and the impact of programs that either support or undermine Black chances for social, political, economic, and cultural flourishing. So, Professor Powell, will you please start us off with a conversation about critical race theory?
Thank you so much for having me and offering me the chance to offer my views, Dr. Clark. And I'm honored to be here with my colleague and good friend, Professor Toussaint. I am going to underscore several tenets of critical race theory and then plug them into current dialogues about race and racism in American society. Critical race theory is, as you point out, an interdisciplinary study. And I should point out two other founding doctrinal members of the critical race theory canon is Dr. Derek Bell, Professor Derek Bell, and Richard Delgado. And they have written a broad range of work, as well as Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, as well as other scholars in this area. But critical race theory is an attempt to look at structural inequality and systemic racism and the underlying processes that perpetuate and maintain racism. And critical race scholars will say that there are a number of tenets, but four or five of them seem to be prominent in everyone's work. One is that racism is ordinary and difficult to address because it's never really acknowledged. So racism in and of itself is an organizing feature of American society. Another tenet is interest convergence. In other words, there's little incentive to eradicate racism unless it aligns with white interests. One example of this is Brown versus Board of Education, Derek Bell writes about, where Brown declared separate but equal inherently unequal unanimously, but that was only because of the way that the United States was being perceived in the world during the Cold War. So we couldn't continue to oppress people of color and then lecture the rest of the world on democracy if our schools were segregated along a racial line. And so you get a unanimous result, but critical race scholars look at that result as really collateral because it really doesn't embrace substantive equality. Another tenet of critical race theory is that race is socially constructed. Society invents race in order to advance its own interests. So it racializes certain groups. You see, just recently, the former president racialized this notion of Chinese flu in order to advance the flawed and illusory notion that Chinese people were responsible for the pandemic, or criminalizing Black Lives Matter as insurrectionists rather than legitimate political activists, or turning the insurrection inside out and saying that the white supremacists were simply tourists. All of these are ways of signaling and racializing race, and that is another tenet that race is socially constructed. Another is intersectionality. This is where Kimberly Williams Crenshaw comes in because she looks at the fact that no person has a single, easily stated unitary identity. So critical race scholars look at race and how race and other factors function, race and gender, race and disability, race and religion, race and national origin. So there are complex relationships that race has, and the implications are nuanced when you place race with other factors. Another critical race theory tenet is the unique voice of people of color, storytelling. So the anti-critical race theory movement that we are seeing now is an attempt to erase history, to erase the stories of people of color and other oppressed people. Critical race theory really functions on how people tell their stories, not anecdotes, but substantive examples of structural inequality. And then finally, critical race theory focuses on the role of the law in perpetuating subordination. So critical race theory actively engages and critiques neutrality. Most of the law is premised on the fact that the law is neutral, that everyone receives a chance, that everything is open, that systems and processes work in a way that is presumptively fair. But critical race theorists unpack this and look specifically at how neutrality perpetuates inequality. For example, the discriminatory intent requirement under the Equal Protection Clause. You have to show specific discriminatory action by the state itself, which is almost impossible to prove. Or if you look at school desegregation cases, how the US Supreme Court has retreated from the substantive mandate of Brown and looked at basically voluntary choice, which leads to resegregation of schools. Or the current debate that we're having now over voting rights, where the Supreme Court says we don't even need a Voting Rights Act. So all of these are examples of critical race theory, how the law is viewed as a reifying influence in perpetuating inequality. Those are the central tenets of critical race theory.
Okay, thank you, Professor Powell and Professor Toussaint.
Good evening, and thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. It's a tremendous honor to be before you today, to be in conversation with my colleague, Professor Powell. He did such an excellent job at laying out some of the foundations of critical race theory. I think what I'll do is build upon what he's provided by giving a little bit of historical context. I think he's absolutely right that critical race theory is a body of scholarship and a body of thinking that developed within law schools maybe approximately 40 years ago. But in fact, the project of critical race theory and what it is attempting to do is part of a much longer and older conversation, both in law, but more generally in society. And so I'll actually start us off thinking about how society thought about law prior to the Renaissance period. To me, there are two fundamental questions that critical race theory is sort of tugging at, this conversation that critical race theory enters. The first question is, what is law? The second question is, how do you teach what law is to citizens within a society? So prior to the Renaissance period, rather, the dominant conception of law was governed by religious ideology, right? There are many intellectuals and philosophers that we can point to from the classical era that sort of spoke to the notion of what law is. One classic example might be Thomas Aquinas, who lived during 1225 to 1274. And he provided for us this notion that there are four different types of laws: eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. And in his articulation of what law is, he essentially developed a theory whereby human laws were built upon a divine law that existed. The notion that there are laws that exist that we then inherit, and then we interpret those laws and build upon them to create human laws. So there are certain rules, so to speak, that govern how humans interact with them, sort of moral principles, so to speak. What the Enlightenment era did was challenge the religious dominance on what law meant. And it introduced the notion of science and rationality as a new way to think about how humans interact with one another and the rules that govern human interactions and human behavior. So instead of divine law, we began to think about reason as a way to think about the moral dimensions of how humans choose to behave, what behaviors are deemed good and what behaviors are deemed bad. So that began to call into question the notion that religion is the dominant place where we think about what law is and where law stems from. So you can begin to see why this is becoming very political today in terms of what this debate really means. It really has to get to the core of our notion of morality and ethics in society and how we frame what governs that. The second question then is, how do you teach what law is? So when the United States was founded and became the United States after the American Revolution, we were still building upon a British conception of law, but it was coming out of an Enlightenment era where we were beginning to think about government through this lens of rationality, through this lens of reason, and through these political principles that were being developed by the philosophers and lawyers of that time, right? What does liberty mean? What does equality mean? No longer were they basing the definition of those principles by a divine law. They were basing the definition of those principles by a sort of man-made, rationalized a law, so to speak. The way that lawyers in the United States initially learned the law was actually not going to law school. There were two options initially, if you go back to the 1600s and 1700s. And at that moment, the only people that were studying the law were white men. You either went to the Inns of Court, right, in Europe, or you did what we might call today an apprenticeship, sort of study under someone else who is licensed to practice law. But the study of law at that time also included the study of works of religion, philosophy, literature, the study of law was a more comprehensive assessment of not just the law, but culture, arts that helped to shape how we thought about what law meant. And once we got into the 1800s, there was an effort to shift the study of law into the modern university and to make the study of law into a science. In a sense, it was a desire to make the profession of lawyering more accessible to more members of the society. Of course, that did not include everyone. We were thinking at this time, really, white men as the dominant person that would become a lawyer. When law shifted into the university to be studied as a science, the way this was done was to describe law as formal, as objective, as being described by neutral and objective laws, similar to science. And so by applying neutral and objective laws to fact scenarios, almost like an equation, we could come out with the appropriate decision for every single case that we were assessing. So there was an effort to both study law and think about law in an objective, almost scientific way. And this was described as legal formalism. And it also was part of what most law schools still use today in terms of how you teach that, the case method, which is reading legal opinions, sort of reviewing the facts of those cases, and then applying the principles of law almost in a formulaic fashion to determine what the holding of the case should be, right? And so the point was that the law should be viewed as objective, it should be viewed as neutral and separate from politics, right? The law is in fact outside of society. Immediately, this was met with resistance. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, individuals resisted this conception of what law is and how you teach it. And their main argument was, well, no, we have to take into account politics. We have to take into account culture. We have to take into account the nuances of what judges and lawyers are doing when they're reviewing these cases. And so this movement, which came to be called the legal realist movement, tried to challenge the notion that the law was abstract, the law was neutral and objective, and really began to push lawyers to think more holistically about what law is and how judgments are rendered. This was largely a scholarly debate, but it also filtered into how law practice began to evolve. Eventually, we get to, and this does in fact change the way we teach law, right? Originally, we're really focused on the study of contracts, property, and eventually, once we get into the mid-20th century, we begin to study more intentionally in law schools, constitutional law, administrative law. So we're beginning to think about the law more broadly and thinking about the political process and how that impacts the development of law. So constitutional law, et cetera, becomes a more foundational part of what it means to study the law in law schools. And then there's a lot of stuff happening historically at the same time. So we have the civil rights movement, you have Vietnam, you have this sort of this social movements that are also impacting what's happening in law schools. And after the civil rights movement, we develop a movement in the law schools called the critical legal studies movement. And this is a movement that actually predates critical race theory. And this was a movement by law professors that we would describe today as left-leaning politically. And they wanted to challenge how the law was being taught and what we thought about what the law is. So again, it's going back to this fundamental debate. What is the law? How do you teach the law? What does the law mean? And their main point was that the law is indeterminate. We describe it as an indeterminacy critique in the legal academy. And what that meant is that when you apply the law to the facts of cases, they lead to unexpected conclusions. And so it's not scientific, but it's very much motivated by the political biases of judges, by sort of how you interpret culture, what's happening in society at the time. All those things sort of come into play. And so it led them to question the fundamental assumptions of law, right? The assumption of what a right means, what an entitlement is. Once you begin to see that the law is shaped by culture, shaped by politics, then what we think of as a right is called into question. Well, is that actually what a right means, or is that what those judges thought a right meant at that particular time? And of course, they were also calling into question the structure of the economy itself, right? Is capitalism the best way to structure a political economy? Or is capitalism a sort of political view, a cultural view? Do we need to critique it? Do we need to push back against it? Right? Is our political economy an objective, structure, or is it a subjective interpretation of how to organize markets? And so they had this debate, and then what Professor Powell so powerfully described, African-American lawyers, African-American scholars said, well, wait, we agree with you that culture plays a role, that politics plays a role in the construction of law, but what we're not talking about is the culture of white supremacy in the United States. And if we are saying that what law is and how you teach law needs to think about politics, culture, and how those things shape our conversation, then we need to have an honest conversation about the culture of white supremacy in this country and ask ourselves, has racism impacted what judges were doing in the 1800s? Has racism impacted how the legislature was making laws throughout the 20th century, right? Was politics influencing what lawyers were doing? So the main question that CRT scholars asked, right, is what about the lens of race? And so they begin to introduce all these critiques that Professor Powell so clearly provided to us. And that is the primary project of critical race theory, which is to consider the ways in which the structure of United States law could have been shaped by racial ideology, could have been shaped by racist politics, and to really think about the different dimensions of that. So it's very much a method of analysis. It's not it's what everyone is trying to say, that all white people are racist. It's not really focused on individuals. It's really focused on the system. It's focused on the rule of law and thinking about whether the way our political economic system, the way our rule of law is designed, has been shaped by the culture of racism. So I'll stop there and let us continue on.
Hey, thank you both so much for your outstanding analysis of of critical race theory, and also providing us historical and cultural background in terms of how we've come to this point, and in the ways in which these factors shaped the emergence of critical race theory. We want to say to our audience that we welcome your questions to our speakers tonight, which you can provide in the chat function that you can access. And so we ask you to submit your questions and to our guest speakers. What I will do is we wait for our speakers, or rather for our listeners to contribute to the chat, is start off with an initial question. What strategies would you suggest to counter the fictions and fallacies regarding CRT, especially in a world of QAnon conspiracies and pervasive misinformation in a variety of media?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So I'm doing some work on what I call post-racialism and the resurgence of white supremacy. And I think we have to directly engage the rhetoric that is circulating. You mentioned the anti-critical race theory legislation. There are bills here in Kentucky that seek to censor any complete history of oppressed peoples, because the reasoning goes that we're stigmatizing young students and making them feel like they are guilty of something that they haven't had any part in, and that is racially divisive. But this is really a movement to move past race and to maintain white supremacy. And I can give you several examples. One is this ongoing rhetoric in the political sphere that the election was stolen. And so that goes hand in hand with some of the things that the US Supreme Court has been doing. The US Supreme Court doesn't say that the election was stolen, but it says that states should have increased power to determine how people vote. And there was an old case called Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which literally gutted the Voting Rights Act. But what is really significant about that opinion is it sent a signal to states that they should be actively engaged in suppressing the votes of people of color and the poor. And so right after that decision, you have states like North Carolina and Texas and Georgia starting down this long and treacherous road of declaring voter fraud. There is no voter fraud, but these election machinations have tried to suppress the vote by changing polling places, by using voter purges, by saying that elections are illegitimate, by challenging secretaries of state. So this is a concerted movement along with the distorting rhetoric that the election process is flawed and illegitimate. So these voting irregularities means that they have to have audits, which basically delegitimize our political process. That's one example of the ongoing rhetoric that we have to engage. Another is the criminalization of Black protests. You know, this inside out rhetorical move of looking at Black Lives Matter activists who are skilled, who are advancing their claims peacefully in a public square, fully embracing the First Amendment as citizens and advocates, but they're criminalized as criminals. And compared and contrast to insurrectionists on January 6th, who were the true white supremacists, but they're labeled as patriots. So there's this whole criminalization of the Black body and undermining the political message that people are trying to engage in peacefully and constructively. There's also the politicization of mass mandates. This notion of libertarianism means that an individual's interests determine the well-being of the community. And so now you have arguments being made that, well, it's my liberty interest, my rights, without any regard to the community as a whole. Another thing is equating any anti-racist work with being a racist. So that's really the ultimate form of deflection. Whenever you bring up racism, structural inequality, and its effects, you're automatically labeled as someone as divisive. Look at the recent Senate confirmation hearings of Judge Brown Jackson. The same type of rhetoric is circulating there, where they tried to associate her with this fraught term, critical race theory, and that she's using them in her rulings. So this notion has been used to undermine effective Black protests. And then a final thing is the weaponization of the First Amendment as an attack on critical race theory. That's probably the biggest lie of all. And the goal is to create, maintain, and enshrine a celebratory story of whiteness devoid of any mention of the complexity, nuance, and enduring effects of systemic racism and structural inequality. And so then you also have these memory laws, which I call them, that try to erase the history of the United States. We're really legislating now about the history of feelings, and you have whites saying, I feel that I'm being threatened. I feel that I'm being told that I'm guilty of something. So this leads to historical relativism, and we're using now feelings as a device for censorship. So we're trying to totally erase American history through these anti-critical race theory law. So I would encourage everyone to be active, to be engaged. We here in Kentucky have been fighting this anti-critical race theory law through editorials, through marches, through actively engaging with our legislators and trying to push back on this pervasive rhetoric that seeks to characterize people who really want substantive equality to work as going against the system.
Professor Etienne?
Yeah, I think Professor Powell is exactly right. So I had the opportunity to testify in South Carolina before the legislature on one of these bills that similar to what we've seen going on around the country to ban critical race theory, to ban the 1619 Project. And there were many people testifying and discussing the extent to which, elementary school students, high school students are not learning CRT, and really trying to unpack this. One of the points that I made that I think is quite interesting that is missed, this notion that we need to protect children from anxiety, guilt, trauma. My simple response was, well, if you shift outside of what Toni Morrison called the white gaze, there are many, many children across this country, Black, brown, who have experienced trauma in school settings for decades. I mean, we have all seen the civil rights pictures of little children being marched into school surrounded by soldiers and hecklers, right? I mean, that is the literal trauma of trying to wrestle with this issue. So the notion that students need to be saved from, trauma or angst is the notion that is a new thing, to me, is quite laughable. But outside of all that, I think it is very important to distinguish what we're talking about. I think one of the problems is that we're trying to lump all these topics that Professor Powell kind of noted into one conversation. And to me, there are two central questions. The first question that I think CRT, at least in its initial origin, was trying to answer is, have we achieved the goals of Reconstruction? When we emancipated formerly enslaved Africans and Black people, we passed the Reconstruction Amendments, we had certain goals in place. We had goals of equal protection. We had goals of fairness under the law. We had goals to eliminate racial discrimination. And I think the fundamental question that CRT was trying to get at is, have we achieved those goals? And if we have not, then as a society, what steps do we need to take to make sure that all of our citizens experience equal protection of the laws, all of our citizens experience, the rights and privileges of being an American citizen? That is one question. And that is a question that forces us to think very critically about law, to think very critically about the structure of communities, whether it's education, whether it's economics, whether it's healthcare, to look at all the different facets of society and think about how we can reform so that we can realize, right, that vision of Reconstruction. The second question, I think, is a much deeper question that is a little more difficult to answer, but that is also part of why different factions around the country are getting so animated. And that question is, what does it mean to be an American? Right? Frederick Douglass famously, looked at the 4th of July and said, this has nothing to do with me. Your idea of liberty has nothing to do with my experience and the experience of enslaved Black people. And if we think about what it means to be an American and our foundational principles, right? Liberty, equality, justice. When the founders of our country drafted the Constitution, like the play Hamilton said, there were a lot of people not in the room where it happened, right? The Africans, women, they were not in that room. So when those men drafted that Constitution, drafted that vision of what America should be, there were a lot of cultural views that were not taken into account. So when we talk about whether our vision of America today is a truly democratic vision, it's very hard to say that, because the structures of America at its very foundation that we sort of build upon did not contemplate everyone in that initial iteration. So Langston Hughes famously said, "Let America be America again." This idea that we are still working towards achieving what we want, what we think America can be. And I think that's a much deeper question, because it requires a moral reckoning, right? There are many people, if you go across the South, that would say, I'll tell you exactly what it means to be an American, right? They'll point you to a Confederate flag. They'll tell you these are the values of what it means to be American. But then you can go to another community. You can go to a predominantly Black community, et cetera, and say, well, what does it mean to be American for you? And they say, well, for me, being American doesn't mean, leave me alone. Don't tread on me. Being American means I haven't experienced liberty. I've experienced roadblocks. I haven't experienced the kinds of entitlements or rights that I need to flourish. I'm experiencing roadblocks to voting. So there are different experiences of being an American. And I think part of this conversation is trying to answer, what do we want this America to be? Yeah. And that's going to be a very difficult conversation. And if our youngest children are part of that conversation, it's going to be a difficult conversation for them too. Because for some folks, when they sit down at that kitchen table, they may have to say, great-great-grandpa was a slave owner. And we have to think about what that means, but also think about where we're going as a family, where we're going as a country. And I don't think everyone in this country is ready to have that honest conversation. They're trying to, as Professor Powell said, they're trying to erase that memory and pretend some of these things never happened.
Well, thank you for that. And just two things that come to mind before we get to a couple of questions that are in the chat. When you spoke of when you were talking, and correct me if I'm wrong, I remember a speech Thurgood Marshall gave in 1988, I think it was in Hawaii, about the Constitution, which was critical, and he, caught a good bit of flack about that. And it seems that what he was trying to say, what he was saying, was that in effect that there were certain folks not around the table at the drafting, at of the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. And this was like a year removed from the 200th anniversary of the beginning of the convention. And that's, one of the things that came to mind, as you see Marshall, one of the great pillars of the civil rights movement, and who, was making this statement and challenging the prevailing wisdom. The second thing I was reminded of was becoming acquainted in a course on the civil rights movement I took in divinity school, where we discussed an article by David Hall at the University of Oklahoma, his article on the 6 fallacies of the Brown decision. And this would have been 1985 at that time, right at about the advent of critical race theory. And that, one of the things in terms of addressing, this question about, that critical race theory wrestled with in terms of, what was, the real efficacy of civil rights legislation. And the 6th point that Hall made was that the Brown decision did not signal the end of racism in education or the larger society, but changed the tactics of domination. And so those are 2 things that sort of came to mind that correspond with the comments that you both have made. And I want to get to these couple of questions in the chat. The first one is, how does one address the negative terminology used by the right wing concerning CRT? What can we say to these incorrect claims?
Well, I think it's difficult, but you always have to reframe it by talking about what critical race theory actually does. It seeks to actively critique, assess, analyze, and evaluate how systems and processes and structures advance inequality. And you can show that in a number of different ways. So you always have to push back when people are trying to create space in critical race theory and reinterpret it. So now people are using critical race theory who are against it, and they say, well, it's an indoctrination tool to grow a new group of social justice warriors in teaching them how to hate their country. And so the response to that is, no, we're not doing that. What we're trying to do is give a complete history. First of all, critical race theory isn't taught in elementary school or high school or preschool. It's not indoctrination. But I think we all should have the common interest in having a full and complete history of America. It's everyone's story. And to have an incomplete history, you're not giving the students the proper respect that they deserve. You're saying that they need to be coddled and insulated from reality. And that isn't an education, that's a form of indoctrination itself. So they need the critical tools to assess a full and comprehensive history, and then they can come to their own conclusions, but they cannot do so with an incomplete history.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, there's a tendency to try to lump everything under this phrase, critical race theory. You'll hear many people say, oh, that's critical race theory is Marxism, or critical race theory is socialism, or it's communism. Everything that they're afraid of comes under this term. And really, it's a kind of scare tactic, which is a common political tool, right? It's, using fear to get voters to sort of shift their votes toward a more conservative posture, right? That's a familiar political tool. But I would say the response simply say what critical race theory is, like Professor Powell said, but also, acknowledge that it is important to have those conversations, but these conversations need to be taken apart one piece at a time. I'm totally fine with folks having a debate about how our political economy should be structured, whether it should be a capitalist economy, socialist economy, communists, what have you. But first, let's have that conversation and talk about what those things mean and then have that debate. And I think it is important for students, especially, to learn what these things mean, to begin to critically think about the benefits and drawbacks of these different approaches to structuring an economy. And again, critical race theory does not take a moral or ethical position, right? What critical race theory is saying is we need to examine our legal system. We need to examine our political institutions using the lens of race, because it is going to reveal, or it may. I'm not even gonna say it will, right? I think it will, but I don't even think that's what critical race theory is saying. It's saying it might. That's the point. If we never analyze it using the lens of race, then what we are tacitly saying is that the racial disparities that we see in society today that we've normalized, we're saying those have nothing to do with the legacy of racism, the legacy of racial oppression that still not just still persists today, but I mean, Brown v. Board of Education happened, but we were still trying to desegregate schools 20 years later. A lot of folks think you're bringing up old stuff. For many people, this is not old stuff. For many people, it's just a memory they have of their life, right? Of early on in their life. So a lot of this stuff is not old. People continue to experience discrimination today.
Sure.
And I think that's enough for it to be important enough to have those conversations.
There's a question that's come regarding effective protest. And the question is, do Black Lives Matter protesters hurt their own cause by advocating for defunding the police?
No, I think that's another example of how the rhetoric has been shaped. And so there's this debate within the Democratic Party about this notion of too much wokeness, we're being too radical, we need to be more moderate and appeal to a broader base. And I take issue with that. I think that the defund was probably an awkward term because everyone likes sound bites and something appealing. I don't think Black Lives Matter was talking about taking away money from the police department and then we don't have any public safety or anything. The Republicans made great hay out of that with a commercial where there was an emergency phone call and there was no one there to answer it, and it just showed a community in chaos. I don't think the argument was that. The argument was a structural one, arguing that maybe we need to demilitarize the police, maybe we need to look at how force is used, and maybe in some instances where we don't need to call out 8 or 9 police officers when someone is having a mental health crisis, a therapeutic response. But then the response on the other side is that soft on crime and that. But again, that is a response that isn't critical and nuanced to look at the context that we're in. I mean, you can't use force every time there is a public safety issue. We have to be able to critically assess. And so we've had this machinery that's built up, mass incarceration, the total dilution of the Fourth Amendment. I mean, the constitutional law on this issue is horrible. They've just given police officers more and more opportunities to engage the citizenry. And then whenever the citizenry even asks questions or push back, the response is a violent one. So I think we need to clearly define our terms. I don't think the Black Lives Matter movement hurt its cause. I just think they needed to articulate it better. And people on the listening end need to be more critical in what they're hearing and actually examine what these slogans mean.
Yeah, and the other point is that I think that's exactly right? And these are not new conversations. You go back to the 70s, 80s, and the conversation was, how do we shift away from criminalizing low-income Black communities and provide the resources that they need, right? There were groups, I grew up in New York City, in the Bronx. There were groups that we now call gangs, right, that were protesting for healthcare services for individuals in the city that were suffering from drug addictions. And they were saying, we need healthcare. These people are addicted to drugs. We need the government to step in. Instead, what did we do? We criminalized the people who were addicted to drugs, and we sent in a police force to try to address that healthcare issue, which led to, of course, mass incarceration. And then we, in the 80s, we saw tough on crime, right? Broken windows, stop and frisk eventually came into play. This idea was, if you're poor, you don't have a job, and you're starting to start some trouble, the answer is to lock you up. The answer isn't employment opportunities, infrastructure development, public works programs. The answer is policing. And so there's a long, long history of police as the answer. And I think that is really what this movement has been about, shifting away from police as the answer to every problem in low-income communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your responses. There's another question that we have, is saying that it's not taught in elementary schools a roundabout if the teachers are taught it during their education. I guess the it they're referring to is CRT.
Oh, so they're still teaching it anyway, but just not calling it that? Is that it?
Yeah, or it's sort of I guess it's
Yeah, I've heard this argument. I've heard this argument come into play, right? Someone said, well, when I was at the legislature here, they were saying, well, if you go to the teachers' college at the university, they're learning CRT, right? So they know those principles and they're weaving it into their lecture in a way that is accessible to the students. And I would say that the goal of critical race theory is to create critical thinkers. And so teachers who are learning about critical race theory in their university training, it's to position them with tools to think critically about the subject matter that they're teaching the students. But teachers are also trained to think about how to provide this information to the students at the level where they're at. And so, as Professor Powell said, they're certainly not providing that information at the kind of theoretical level that we're learning at law schools. But students do need to learn how to think critically. They need to learn how to review facts, look at an issue from different vantage points, different sides, and learn how to weigh the merits of different kinds of arguments. That is part of the goal of educating students to think critically. And so it's certainly not indoctrination, right? It's helping students to learn how to think critically, providing them with different viewpoints at an age-appropriate level. And teachers are certainly trained at how to provide information to students at an age-appropriate level. So I certainly don't think because they're learning about critical race theory in their university training, that means that they're passing along, they're indoctrinating students per se with a viewpoint once they get into the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for example, say if you have someone in teachers college and they learn critical race theory and then they have a 5th grade class, they're not going to have the discussion that we're having now. They would have maybe a full history, so that the history books are really a problem as well, because they go from slavery, then Brown versus Board of Education, then everything was okay, and then President Obama. So you need a skilled teacher to understand those gaps in history and provide a full comprehensive view to the students. And another thing that type of question does is really dangerous. We have to be careful about this. Is I think we're approaching a scenario where we're talking about censorship. For example, we have parents saying, well, I get the right to determine the curriculum. How arrogant is that? Because you may be determining it for your child, but what about everyone else in the system? So that's a dangerous road that we're going down, where we have parents with no expertise other than the types that they want to select for everyone to be taught. And that's a very dangerous, because you get to the road of viewpoint discrimination, censorship, and then the entire educational system lacks legitimacy because it doesn't embrace the principles of free thought and engagement.
Mhm. One question, and this might be one of our last questions. We heard and read in the discourse about CRT a great deal about discomfort created by discussions about slavery, Jim Crow, contemporary racism. As scholars, can you address the role of discomfort as essential to education, especially as regards American racism?
Well, that's a heavy one. So I'll approach it this way. I just taught my critical race theory seminar today. And before the semester even begins and I sent out the syllabus, there are guidelines to our discussion. We don't name call, we don't point fingers at people, we don't say you're responsible for all of this. But we recognize that when we talk about race, it's a fraught topic, and there will be discomfort. There's no way around that. But you cannot internalize that discomfort. If we are looking at structural inequality, I'm not saying you, white person, are responsible for this, and we're looking at everything that you did and you're guilty. One of the major things that critical race theory does is it's a critique against liberal individualism. In other words, the individual coming to these decisions, and the Constitution only protects individuals, not groups. Critical race theory moves away from that and looks at structures and systems. And so those impacts are devastating, and they have huge consequences. So the discussions are bound to be awkward sometimes discomforting, but there's no way to sanitize history. There's no way to sanitize real world conditions. And if we are anything as scholars, our role is to help guide our students and the public in addressing these issues in a nuanced and complex way that is inclusive, but recognizes the reality that these are difficult issues.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect answer. You know, I have three sons, and so I'm very sensitive to the desire to want to protect my children, right? I protect them from harm, protect them from danger, protect them from discomfort. But the truth of the matter is, every Black person in America knows that at some point they're going to have to who has a child knows they're going to have to sit down with their child and have the talk, right? To talk about what does it mean to be Black in this country? What does it mean to potentially interact with a police officer, to talk to them about some of the things that they're not going to learn in school, to tell them part of being human in this country means having to potentially face discomfort, to face uncomfortable situations, and learning how to navigate those situations successfully, right? With grace, with dignity, with intelligence, with wisdom, and not to, end up doing something harmful to yourself or to someone else. And so I think there's this notion that we can protect children, and maybe there have been certain communities that have been able to shelter their children, so to speak, from having to deal with some of these issues because of our legacy of segregation. But I think part of this racial reckoning, part of coming to terms with what the history of our country is teaching students how to, one of the questions says, can you trust the state to teach critical thinking? Part of teaching students how to think critically is also teaching them how to deal with some of the discomforting things in history, right? Not just the things that affirm them, make them feel good, but the things that might discourage them. Because we all know that the only way you can build a muscle is to break it down, to focus on unique parts of the body one at a time, break it down, and then build it up. And I think the learning process is similarly a process of deconstruction and then reconstruction, right? Let's deconstruct this issue, look at its component parts, try to understand the things that are good, the things that are bad. And that develops in students a kind of character to identify right? How to progress. And so I think the conversation that we need to be having, as Professor Powell said, is not censorship, but how to think critically about the things that we say so that we can avoid harmful communication, harmful behavior, and that so we can have more and more of positive, empowering, uplifting, fair, anti-discriminatory, anti-racist conversations with one another about what we want this country to be, how we want to address the problems that we see around us, and how we want to be better Americans for our children and for the future generation. You know, and that's the role of teachers. That's what teachers are trying to do day in and day out. When I go in my class, I let students know we're going to be fair, we're going to be respectful to one another, just as Professor Powell said, but some of the things we learn, you may not like. You know, some of the things might make you feel uncomfortable. And this is a space that is designed for us to grow together, for us to think about these issues, and for you to then graduate, go into the world and try to be the change you want to see. Change those issues that make you uncomfortable in the classroom, that someone else doesn't have to deal with that in the future.
Well, Professors Powell, Professor Toussaint, I want to thank you both so very much for just an excellent analysis of critical race theory, and in which I trust that those who joined us also enjoyed as well. And we want to thank all of our participants in the online audience for joining us tonight. We invite you to come back again on Wednesday, April 13th, when Professor Gregory Parks from Wake Forest comes to provide part 2 of this series on critical race theory. We're really grateful that you took out the time to spend time with us on this important topic. And so thank you again, all of you, for coming and participating, and we'll see you again on the 13th. Thanks so much and have a good night.
Thank you.